Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our October webinar, Putting the Puzzle Pieces Together. We're so excited about continuing our discussions around environmental prevention on college campuses and the importance of working with campus and community partners as we work to address collegiate substance misuse. So I'm going to turn it over to Brittany Sandage, one of our panelists today, and we're going to get started.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Brittany Sandage, and I am an employee here at Drug Free Action Alliance in Columbus, Ohio. I am the Director of Coalitions, and what that means is I do quite a bit of community work and have seen the strategic prevention framework, what we're going to talk about today, utilized in a lot of different types of communities with different types of partners around the table, and I'm excited to support Cindy and the Ohio College Initiative in kind of just getting this conversation moving. So without any further ado, let me first cover a few housekeeping moments. On the right-hand side of your dashboard, you will have an area for chat as well as questions. Throughout the broadcast today, I will be responding to questions, so feel free to engage us there. And in addition, to make this the most accessible experience possible, for all of our Ohio College campuses, we will be recording this broadcast today, and it will be available, as will the slides, later in a follow-up email. So as we move forward, I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Krista Bennett, and we will get started.
Thank you, Brittany. Hi, everybody. This is Krista Bennett. I'm a program manager at Drug Free Action Alliance. I provide support, and I also help with the problem gambling. I do trainings, basically everything that you could think of that anybody needs some help with. So I'm really excited to step in and help Cindy today and talk about the strategic prevention framework. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And when we think about the strategic prevention framework, it's really trying to think of a process, a tool that can get you from point A to point B, which isn't always as easy as it looks. Sometimes you think it's going to be quick. Sometimes it takes a few different steps, and so we're going to walk you through the process today to kind of help you give you a tool to kind of move forward and get your group on track. So, in order to provide meaningful, effective, and timely prevention services, those services have to be based on a comprehensive strategic plan, a plan that's data-based, evidence-based strategies. And it can't just be based in good intentions. It can't just be, this might work. You're trying to look at things that are going to be evidence-based, that are going to be thoughtful. They're not going to be wasting time, energy, or resources. If you're just working in good intentions, it can be very frustrating. You can lose a lot of energy from your group. And sometimes the problem doesn't get better, and it can even get worse. So well-intentioned strategies have been shown to increase, or well-intentioned strategies, sometimes that are not thought through, can be shown to increase use. All right, so this is going to be the introduction of the strategic prevention framework. This has been used in prevention quite a bit. It might not be as pervasive in campus strategies. It might not be something that you've seen quite frequently, but this is a tool that a lot of coalitions use. So it's a process that is 5 steps. It's assessment, capacity, planning, implementation, and evaluation. And we're going to walk through these steps today. But as you'll see in the middle of the flower, which it can look like a flower, some people call it a pinwheel, whatever you choose to call it works. In the middle of it is sustainability and cultural competence. And these two are the key pieces that need to be maintained throughout the entire SPIF process. That's why they're placed in the center, is that throughout each step that you work in, you want to be mindful of both sustainability and cultural competence. These are things that are going to keep your processes moving forward, your strategy moving forward. So you have to keep them in mind throughout your entire process. So sustainability is about building and maintaining. It's growing champions. It's policies and procedures. It's sustaining outcomes, not programs. And it's ownership. And it's more than just money. So that when you think about sustainability, when you keep this in mind, it's thinking about as you're moving forward, even without the money, the funding that might have gotten your group started, are you going to be able to continue going?
Krista, I heard a community leader once describe this element as the type of thing that you put in place that's going to keep working even if you're asleep or you have to leave your job. It's the type of thing that you're going to be thinking about so that no matter where life takes us or if your strategies or your people in place change, the things you're doing, they're going to be able to outlast it. Is that a good summation of this?
Yes, I would say that's actually a perfect summation of it, is if the people leave, if there is loss of money as leadership changes, which it often does, you can still keep the strategies going. That's what sustainability is. That's actually a perfect way. Whoever said that is a genius. So credit to that person. The importance of it is that if you find that momentum with your actions, you don't want it to just halt because of funding or because somebody ends up leaving, so that you can keep moving forward. And you don't want to have these gap periods due to lack of sustainability planning. So a lot of times if you have that halt because there's funding or somebody has to re-strategize because there was a change in leadership, it's harder to get back into that swing of things, harder to get into that place where you started, and you lose that momentum and that energy, which is so important with these processes. So cultural competence, moving on to the other part of the center of the flower, is being really mindful of needs, styles, values, beliefs. Thinking about your target population, thinking about the people that are involved in this, making sure that you are keeping all of those in mind throughout the process. So as you're going through the steps, you want to have this kind of check-in as far as, are we being culturally competent? Are we identifying who our target audience is, and are we engaging with them? Are we keeping them in mind as we move forward? And that's just, yeah, keep it in mind. The importance of this is that when you're thinking about it, it improves your effectiveness and quality of programs, the policies, and practices that you're choosing, and eliminates service and participation disparities. So again, it's just trying to keep all of these people in mind, your target population, making sure, a lot of people like to say, not about us, without us. So trying to keep that in mind. If you're not reaching your target population effectively, you want to go back and question, are we being culturally competent? So when we're thinking about the strategic prevention framework and going back to those steps that we first introduced, they are put in a specific order. And you think about this because, you know, there is a reason why we have these steps in place. It's not just because that's how people say it is. It's intentional. So you think about what could go wrong if you skipped a step. And that's why we talk about putting the cart before the horse, or as you look at this picture, it's the horse before the cart, because it helps you move forward. If you put the cart before the horse, which a lot of times we do, we think we know the answers, we think we have the right things put in mind, and we put the cart before the horse, and then all of a sudden we're not moving forward. So it's something to be mindful of why we have these steps put in this place. And if you skip one of these steps, you might lose that momentum. You might forget to put a wheel on, so to speak, and then all of a sudden you're not moving as well as you could be. So one of the first steps that we have after talking about sustainability and cultural competence is assessment. So this is really being a detective and profiling your population's needs, the resources, and readiness to address the needs and gaps. Basically, at the end of the day, what it's doing is talking about what is going on in our community or what is happening on our campus. So it's trying to sleuth out and figure out what's going on here. And that includes, assessment includes many different layers. These would be assessing needs, which can be looking at what are the substance abuse trends in your community or on your campus, or any other trends that you're looking at. Looking at common negative consequences, how can you identify contributing factors? Assessing demographic and geographic features. So sometimes it kind of helps to explore these features as they can direct our efforts. And for example, possibly a use pattern or a problem is higher in a subpopulation. So that's why you want to look at the demographic and geographic features. You also want to assess your policies, which are formal and informal. They can be more than just laws. They can look at workplace, school, with your athletes, those kinds of things. So looking at those policies. And you want to assess your existing services and resources. And sometimes you want to think outside of the box when it comes to those. You want to assess your gaps. So identifying gaps in services and resources, they can help direct your efforts because there's something that's missing potentially. Then you want to assess your readiness, which is a really important thing, is how ready is your community or your campus to be a part of this solution. And it can change throughout the process. And a lot of, especially since we work a lot with coalitions, but you'll see when a lot of groups use this process, they see that readiness change throughout the process. They see a community go from being in denial to being ready for, approaching the solutions.
Krista, I think that's a really great point. One of the common themes that I've seen when campuses and coalitions start to work together, specifically if we're thinking about issues with maybe binge drinking or high-risk drinking in a community, as people are going out and they're sitting around the table and they're gathering all this data and they're trying to figure out what does it all mean, initially people can be a little bit hesitant to share that data to figure out where to go next. So during this assessment process, it's always so important to truly stay on it, try to really get that data, except that some pieces may come later. As you're building the relationships, as people begin to see what you're doing, they're going to be a little bit more apt to be at the table, to keep giving you things that you need. But really this period is all about just being as informed as we can before we move forward into the next step.
Very good. Thanks, Brittany. So when we talk about assessment, we're also identifying the scope of the problem. And the types of information that you're looking at is what's happening, how often is it happening, with who is it happening, and any consequences. And then possible sources of information, which is what we're talking about, is trying to look at your resources. And again, some people might be a little bit more challenged as far as providing what they have, their data that they have. But you can utilize surveys, focus groups, and if you get the buy-in from people and identify them, the key stakeholders we'll talk about in a minute, you can get data from health departments, from law enforcement. All of those things will help drive what you're looking to get, like drive you to your goals. So you want to keep in mind it's not about just what is happening, but why is it happening. So if you look at a problem and you see that it's going on, you go, okay, yeah, there's higher risk drinking, or more students are drinking than they're anything, any higher rates of binge drinking, whatever it might be. But you want to identify why it's happening so that you can address that why, not just the what. And that'll help you get to fixing the problem, solving it. So one of the things that's going to help you drive that why is your capacity building. So capacity, which is the next step in the SPIF, is mobilizing and or building capacity to address needs. And then also matching resources with the needs that you have. That's really important. When we work in coalitions or work in groups, you want to identify the strengths that people have that they can provide and bring to the table. So knowing what your needs are, but also matching resources appropriately. Capacity can include anything from knowledge and skills, specific expertise, relationships across sectors, legal support, data, money, of course, and engagement and enthusiasm. You want to make sure that you're engaging people properly and keeping them enthused. That's something that oftentimes gets lost as you're trying to put this process together, is keeping your audience engaged, keeping the people who are part of the process excited about it. Are those the right people at the table if they're not excited about it? So yeah. So in capacity, you want to identify community stakeholders or key stakeholders. And if you look on the screen, you can see that this is the community wheel. This can help you identify who should be at your table when you're working on strategies, and you can probably identify many other people included in that as well. These people, though, when you identify them, you want to look at people who are affected by the problem, and they have resources to contribute, and they're people with influence, whether it's formal or informal. So it does not have to be somebody in a high standing, but it could be somebody who has really nice pool in a neighborhood, in a school, wherever it might be, and then provide diversity in your community. So you want to make sure, again, that cultural capacity, that cultural competency is being thought about. Are you actually identifying people who look like what your community is, whatever it may be? You want to make sure that those people are at the table. So you need to gain buy-in from these people and allow them to help. When you get these key stakeholders, they're going to be able to be champions for your efforts. They're going to be a part of the process, and they're going to be able to go out and actually pull more people in and help drive your efforts. Let me move on to planning. Planning is the part really where you're trying to develop a strategic and comprehensive plan. It's that part where you've looked at what your needs are, you've assessed your data, you see it, you kind of know what the problem is, you know what kind of goals you're working towards, and then you want to build that capacity as well so you have the resources that you need. And now you want to put the plan together. So it helps you to create an objective profile of your community. You act with intent, you're thoughtful, you want to make sure you're identifying how to focus resources and efforts wisely, and you want to implement more effective strategies. So that's what planning is and the root of it. It's really putting together a very strategic, very thoughtful plan to make sure that what you're doing before you implement it is well thought out. And they should be data-driven, logical, take community readiness into account. I feel like a lot of times that kind of gets lost is that community readiness, and when groups get together, they think sometimes that there is a goal that they have in mind or a problem that they see, and then the data comes back and it's completely different. And they want to be able to address the first thing that they thought of, but you really want to make sure that you're looking at what the community's actual issues are and what they're, where they're at in readiness as well.
One example that comes to mind where this data and the findings of the assessment and the partners you're going to have on board really impacts this area in planning is if you're thinking about doing any sort of educational or media campaign, especially related to high-risk behaviors. How important is it in a media campaign or an educational campaign for us to not only know who is our audience, what is really truly the target group of people who might be engaged in these high-risk behaviors, but also the where they're doing it, the types of attitudes that set into why those behaviors are happening. So in order to get to this point and to put together, how often have we been at the table and everyone knows we've got to put together some education, right? Everyone's ready to just take action. But a lot of time and a lot of resources committed without having some of those background components might render us getting the wrong outcome. We might end up putting together the type of educational resources that don't quite match up to who it is we're trying to impact and the types of changes we're trying to change. For example, if we are really looking at binge drinking behaviors, the assumption might be that this is happening at a specific location on campus, or maybe it's happening, we think it's happening with males. Does the data back that up? All of those pieces, the partners we're going to need to identify those folks, the data we're going to need that comes out of the assessment, that's all going to have fed into this really strategic, thoughtful, data-driven plan component. So not to, belabor the point, but we want to make sure that you're beginning to see sort of how these different steps build on each other and they form this greater picture.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think I completely agree with what Brittany's saying is that, you have an initial thought in mind, but you want to use the data supposed to drive where you're headed to. So you want to keep all of that in mind as you're planning. That way you can lead to hopefully a more effective result in what you're doing. So again, you should look into data-driven, logical, and take your community readiness into account when you're making a strategic plan. But you also should, when you're thinking about planning, you want to think about that goal setting. So your planning should produce strategic goals, measurable outcomes, performance targets, and action plans. So it has to be a well thought out plan for you. You don't want people there's a lot of times where people meet and they just meet to meet and they talk about it and they talk about it and they talk about it in circles and don't really get anywhere. Or they do some strategies, but they haven't measured, they don't have a plan set in place to measure how it looks. They don't have a way to go, what are we looking for? What's our target? What are our goals that we want to get out of this implementation? So frequently what you'll see is a lot of groups will jump straight to that implementation phase and completely disregard these these first three steps, this assessment, capacity, and planning specifically, because it just feels like, okay, yeah, we have all the information we need, so let's just do it. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about those goals and those objectives and the targets and action plans. And when you're thinking about planning, you want to think about a logic model, which we won't go too much into today. That can be its whole other own hour. So we're just going to kind of briefly look at it. And a logic model just helps to kind of create that bridge between your data and assessment and your strategic plan. It brings together both pieces so that you can help build good strategic goals and have a nice plan before you implement. So when you talk about planning, when you talk about a logic model, you're really looking at what the problem is, why is it happening, and why here. And you really want to flesh it out as much as you possibly can to getting down to local conditions. So, you know, we see a lot of times where there's just a problem statement that's put in place of there is high-risk drinking going on. And then the root causes might be, well, there's availability that's around us, and there's a norm put around it as well. And those would be the root causes, is that, you know, it's seen as a norm. And then why here, you want to look specifically at your local conditions, at what's happening in your community or on your campus that drives those norms or drives that availability and that access. And that's kind of where that logic model helps build up what your plan is going to be. So it's kind of just fleshing out when you're looking at a problem, why is it happening? It's not so much the what, it's the why. And then planning, it has long-term outcomes, which is your problem statement, again, going back to the logic model. And then intermediate outcomes are going to be that root cause. So that middle piece that we looked at is the root cause. And then the third piece is the short-term outcomes, which are local conditions. That's what you're looking at. So when you're making a plan, when you're addressing the problem statement, you're looking at things that are going to be a few years down the road. And then those intermediate outcomes are looking at that root cause. Those are going to be less time to try and reach those goals. And then your short-term outcomes are addressing local conditions. That's going to be shorter-term stuff that you can get done fairly quickly, you know, a couple years, a year or two, to kind of address those needs, maybe longer depending on what your strategies are, depending on what you're trying to address. When putting together logic models and putting together plans, people want to see immediate outcomes, and it's nice to give your group some small wins, but it has to be, you know, you want to be realistic when you're thinking of planning. You're not, unless, you know, no one's done anything, you're not necessarily going to reduce rates by 50% or get 0% of, you know, students under 21 drinking. You want to make sure that they're realistic so that you can have those wins, so that you can be planful. So keep those things in mind when you're putting that plan together, is having, you know, your short-term outcomes, your intermediate or, you know, not too far out outcomes, and then long-term outcomes. And then, you know, you want to look at implementing evidence-based or evidence-informed prevention activities if you're doing prevention strategies. So you want to develop action plans for implementing policies, programs, and practices. And you want to implement them and also implement your strategic plan as well. Typical action step components are going to include who and who will do what, and by when, and the resources needed, and who else needs to know. So then we're going to move on to, I'm going to go back, sorry. Oh, sorry, I'm in implementation without even realizing it. I'm sorry. You know, not too much coffee in me yet.
Just comes so naturally to you.
So implementation. So implementation is implementing evidence-based. That makes a lot more sense as I'm reading the slides. So implementing, you're going to implement your evidence-based prevention activities. This is when you're finally actually doing it. That makes a lot more sense as I'm reading them. Wow. So this is really the part where everybody kind of jumps to. It's that we're doing it, And we've done all of the legwork, all of the stuff to plan it out, to make sure that we're getting somewhere, and then we're actually going to get to do it. This is a lot of times where people want to be involved, is doing the implementation phase. So after you've developed those action plans for the implementing, you actually get to implement them now, all of your hard work. And you get to implement your strategic plan. And as I'm reading these slides, it makes so much more sense than what I was talking about. And the typical action steps components do actually include who and who's going to do what. What are you doing? You want to have a by when meeting. When are we doing it? How long is it going to be? What's the length we're looking at? What kind of resources do we need, and do we have them at the table? Again, it's that reminder of, is our capacity fully built? Sometimes you have to jump back. If you are in the implementation phase, you start to do something and there's a hiccup, and you realize, oh, we don't have the right people at the table, or we don't have the right resources. So when you're implementing, you still have to keep in mind of your previous steps. And since it works, since the spiff wheel kind of works as a whole circle, you're allowed to jump back. It's okay. It's okay to go back a few steps and start over and look at what you're doing. So make sure your resources that you have are needed. And who else needs to know? Who else should know? Are you reaching everybody that you should be at this point? Is there more you can do? So when you're implementing, you want to keep all these things in mind. And then we get to move to evaluation, which I think a lot of times it gets skipped over, and that's usually because there hasn't been a plan put in place. When you have a strategic plan put in place, you kind of know where you want to evaluate. You kind of know what your evaluation is already put in place to do, is your outcomes, the goals that you want to aim towards, the targets. So evaluation is just monitoring, evaluating, sustaining, and improving, and replacing those that fail or don't do what you anticipated them doing. Failure doesn't always sound that great.
So, Krista, I was recently in a small community that certainly has a small regional campus on it. And one of the struggles they were having was understanding, all right, if we're looking at this logic model, how are we getting from we want to reduce the cases of this high-risk drinking or some of the crashes that were happening in the area? How do we do that? That's so daunting, because if you think about that kind of problem statement, they want to reduce all this risk behavior. They want to reduce all this drinking. And so we talked really thoroughly about the fact that as you're moving through this 5-step process, you're kind of building the framework for what evaluation is going to look like, right? So under that logic model, when Krista talked about the root causes, those kind of come down to 4 sort of bucket areas, if you will. What kind of community attitudes are we measuring? Is there access and availability to some of maybe the problem substances that we're dealing with? Maybe that's prescription drugs, or it's smokeless tobacco, or it could be a wide range of things. So how are individuals getting at this? Is it easy to get to? We know that if things are easy to get to, we do see rates of use go up, right? We also think about the messaging. What is happening out there that individuals are seeing that is reinforcing the idea that these behaviors are okay? And then to refer back to a point she made, the policies or the practices that are in place. So under that kind of root cause column, all 4 of those bucket areas, if those end up showing up in your data, and I can say by experience they almost always will, each of those, depending on your strategy, are going to be measurable. It's just going to be a task that you're going to be able to track. What's the number of times I engaged, say, a retailer, for example, and talked to them about practices in selling or in serving alcohol, for example? How many types of ways could I go about making sure that enforcement and good policies are in place if, say, student athletes or something of that nature happens and there's an infringement on one of these rule sets? So rather than be daunted by the idea of how do we ever bring down this giant bucket that is a high-risk behavior, breaking it down into the root causes and then into those local conditions where it's really just like the A, B's, and C's of where we're coming. All of those things are going to be measurable if it's a solid plan. And that's how you know you're on the right track. They are becoming measurable. So as you're building this through, you should be able to say, all right, there's a benchmark for each one of these tiers that we've begun to outline. And that's where you know that you're getting to the point of, if something's not quite working, I'm going to be able to spot it. Because in this work and using the strategic prevention framework, we can think of ourselves as everyday scientists, right? We are trying with the best information we have available to put an intervention or a prevention method in place. The brilliant part of that is we can change directions, we can adjust, we can make it better as we learn, as we go.
Thank you, Brittany. That was a really great kind of wrap-up of everything that we're talking about. So as you're getting into the evaluation piece, you have, like Brittany said, it does. We work as scientists, as everyday scientists. Evaluation, as you're building, kind of your tools and your plan, you're looking at what works, what doesn't work, and what to improve and how to improve it. So sometimes you go with best of intentions, and it doesn't, even with all of the planning that you've put into place, it doesn't necessarily land as well as you thought it would. So you have to go back, and that's why we evaluate and look back at the data we've collected and the resources we have. Are we missing something? What else can we do to try and improve this? So that's what evaluation is for. It's for identifying kind of what works and what doesn't. And there's two kinds of evaluation methods. You have outcome and you have process. So outcome is how well are the strategies working in our plan, and that's kind of what the outcome evaluations tell you. And process evaluation tells you how will we ensure that our strategies will improve over time. And you can see here there's a lot of different options for outcome evaluation. You have archival research, you have archival trend data, focus groups, observations, trying to look at different things that you've done. They can be, talking to people basically face-to-face, in doing phone calls, those kinds of things, kind of get an idea of, like we said, how well are the strategies working in our plan. You can ask those people these questions. Are you getting somewhere? Are you moving the needle one way or the other to help you get to your outcomes? So that's how outcome evaluation works. Process evaluation answers the question how, as you can see. How did we do it? How many things did we do? How well did we do it? How can we do it better? So it's very kind of cut and dry, I feel, when you think of process evaluation. And outcome evaluation is really looking at kind of the strategies, the goals that you've looked at, the reaching your target audiences, your target populations. And then, as always, throughout the entire SPIS model, you want to keep in mind, your sustainability and your cultural competence. As you can see, they sit in the middle of the wheel, and so they're always meant to be engaged throughout the entire process. And like we said, sometimes you miss the mark. You are going through the entire process, and you forgot sustainability, you forgot cultural competence, and you want to go back and address those things as well. So sustainability, do you have the momentum to keep going, even if you lose funding or if leadership changes? And then with cultural competence, you want to make sure that you're mindful of the groups you're serving. So throughout each step of the process, and as you keep going through that wheel, which sometimes you're going to have to go through it a few times to get it right, you want to make sure that you're engaging in both these things throughout the entire time.
One of the challenges that I think that we've encountered in the past is thinking in terms of this cultural competence. A campus setting is a little bit different, right? It's sort of a small version of a larger community. And so the benefit to that is you have this geographic and this captured audience, right, of all of your professionals, your faculty, your staff, your students, in which to be able to put a lot of these steps in place, to try new things, to see where you're going. The challenge of that, of course, is that every few years you have a total turnover of some of the potential student body, the culture that might be on campus. And so that does present a unique challenge, I think, to campuses, particularly if they're of a residential nature. A couple of thoughts in sort of overcoming those. might, or just a plan with them, is to think about who are maybe the ambassadors who can help you do this work for you. In a lot of situations, that might engage the student leaders or some of the student ambassadors that you already have, but it also could come from a unique place. If we think about maybe faith-based communities that are on campus, or the athletic associations, or some of maybe the other non-traditional places where messages are being heard, where students are being engaged, where faculty are also present as our staff, those might be some unique avenues to not only collect data, but just to have kind of informal conversations. See what you can get from their reaction to the things that you've done. We all know, and I certainly know, it's really nice when we can get lots of people to respond to our surveys, and we've got that hard number data that we all really, really need, especially if we're executing funded projects. But sometimes we have to get a little bit creative. We have to have those sidewalk conversations. So in thinking about maybe how to ensure that you overcome that not about us, without us, where are those potential folks who could help you do the work, and that you can help train them in sort of what to look for and how to talk about the topic to be your foot soldiers on the ground. Krista, do you have any insight maybe that came from your time working in school districts that might have been a good way to think about how to talk, or maybe what to look for in terms of working well with the community and playing friendly?
Yeah. So I come from a background of working in direct services in Stark County, and we worked a lot with school systems. And when you think about the resources there, not everybody is on the same message. They're all there for the same reason. But not everybody has the same process that they're looking at it. So you would have to think of different ways of engaging and, quite honestly, getting buy-in from those different members that you have in the school system. And that's my specific experience. So, you would think about, what the librarian would want from you and what they could do if they're going to be able to provide any sort of resources for you, or even a space for you to use. The athletic directors and the coaches were a really nice person to tie into, but you want to make sure that you meet them where they are, and always think about that, what's in it for them kind of thing. That's a really great approach, is if you're going to approach somebody about, being a part of this process or getting some sort of buy-in, you want to have something that they're going to benefit from. Even if it's trying to think of a small skill set that they have, or something that's really specific you can ask for them, is having that ask for them so that they know how to get involved. And that gives them a purpose and gives them a drive and brings them into your process and brings them into the entire, brings them into like the message of what you're going into, even if they kind of have a different perspective on it. So you want to make sure that you're looking at all the resources that you have available to you, because there might be somebody that's really great at something that you had no idea until you talk to them about it, until you talk to them and engaged a little bit. So make sure you kind of keep that in mind throughout. So that's the SPIF model, and when you think about it, it really is just it's just a tool. It's a map. There's a lot of times where you've seen different kinds of tools that you can use, and this one just drives us in a different, kind of gets you the same place, but in a different way. And like I said, it works as a wheel, and so you are going to sometimes get into these hiccups. You're going to find a block that doesn't get you exactly what you wanted. But that's why you have such a strategic plan. That's why you develop a plan like this, is so if you hit a hiccup, you can kind of go back and reassess what you're doing. And you really can spiff anything. I mean, honestly, you can think of pretty much anything in your life and turn it into the spiff process, which is exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to talk about getting ready in the morning. So when you're getting ready in the morning, you try and think about, there's so many different aspects that you can do, and I'm actually going to toss it over to Brittany, who's going to take this from me.
Okay. So our scenario is we need to get to a meeting by 10 a.m. on Monday morning, right? That's the end goal. That's what we want to happen. So we're just going to spiff this. What does it take to make sure that me, who pretty much needs 3 pots of coffee to get started in the morning, is going to make a 10 a.m. meeting? So we're going to just kind of assess where we are. How are we going to get there? What do I need to take to it? What routes? What outfits? What do I need? There's just all these components, right? I've got to look cute because it's a really important meeting. I've got to be on time. I know I'm going to be borrowing a car that day from somebody because mine's in the shop. There are all these elements you need to know about, the given circumstances you've got to make that 10 a.m. meeting on Monday. So let's think about how am I going to overcome it? Well, for the past year, I've just figured out what I have at my disposal. Okay, there's a car to borrow. I've got laundry done. I've got these things. I've got all the elements and the people and the resources kind of at my disposal. I've just got to organize them to get this plan in place. So what do I come up with? In planning, I'm going to get my agenda together on Sunday night. I'm going to have my outfit prepared. I'm going to make sure I've borrowed the car. I'm going to have all these things in preparation. Plan to get up when my alarm goes off at 7. And it takes me a while to get ready, guys. So I'm going to get up at 7, try to make this 10 a.m. meeting. And then what? Well, let's put it into action. Everything's going really smoothly. And then I realize I've forgotten the keys, or I've lost them. And this is a really good example of what might happen in an implementation phase when you had everything planned perfectly and then you realize that your keys are in the freezer and you don't know how they got there. But if we've done all of our due diligence and we know that, okay, I know I borrowed it, I can retrace my steps on where those keys might have gone the night before, I'm just going to kind of think backwards and I'm going to come up with a slightly new plan. And that's part of that everyday scientist component that we had. And at the end of the day, this is a pretty simple example. My evaluation is, one, did I make that 10 a.m. meeting? And probably did I make it there with the car that I borrowed and get that back home to the owner? I'm fairly certain my friend would really appreciate it if I could come through on that end. So that's a really simple example. When we've done this in trainings before, we've had everyone spiff whether or not they should get assisted care for their in-laws, whether or not they should buy the Crest or the Colgate toothpaste. The truth is, all this model provides us is a systematic way of making a plan and following through with it, making sure it worked, figuring out where it might not have, where were the weak spots, where were the successes. So truly, you can spiff anything. And if you have better ideas for how we teach this, we are always looking for creative examples. We once had someone talk about how to put together a choir performance. That was phenomenal. I can't sing, and neither can Krista, at least for the purposes of today and today's workshop. But I hope that that gives a little bit of realism to what this is. It's meant to be a useful tool to help you actually solve the problems you need to solve, not to be something that just overcomplicates the process. So as we wrap up here, please know we're here kind of taking questions. We certainly will make sure you've got some resources, but before we go, I'm going to pass this back to Cindy Clowner and let her give you a few updates.
Well, I want to thank Brittany and Krista for leading us and a really great top-down view of the strategic prevention framework, which I think fits nicely with us trying to just get our feet on the ground when it comes to environmental prevention and the steps that we need to understand to be able to do it effectively. We're going to dive a little deeper into these petals, starting with assessment at our next webinar, and that'll be on November 30th. And we have Molly Mitchell from the Maryland Collaborative to Reduce College Drinking and Related Problems. We'll be speaking about how to use environmental scans to reduce excessive alcohol use. So this is one way to collect data, especially if you haven't done an environmental scan. We talked briefly about those at our last webinar. It's a great opportunity to get some of that data. We'll also be talking a little bit more about some other data sources that you can use to get an idea of where the issues are at on your campus and within your community so that you can appropriately address them. We do have some resources that will be in a Dropbox folder, including the slides from today's session, and that Dropbox link will be sent to you in the wrap-up email that will also have a link to the recording of our webinar today, as well as to the evaluation. And if you are interested in continuing education for prevention specialists and chemical dependency counselors, your certificate will be available upon completion of your evaluation. And I also want to encourage you, if you haven't registered yet, our Solutions Summit is coming up next Wednesday on November 2nd. Today is the last day to register. It's $20, and you can visit our website, Drug Free Action Alliance, to find the link to register for the event. It's at the Embassy Suites, Columbus Airport. We have a really great lineup. We're really excited about the event, and I hope that you can join us along with other people from your campus and community leaders that can help support you in your work as addressing substance misuse among your students. Okay, and with that, we want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward hopefully seeing you all next Wednesday. Thank you.